Welcome to the last of our Lenten series on hospitality, and today we'll be exploring the art of welcome, and we'll look at the Eucharist in particular in the light of the art of welcome and hospitality. Christine Poole tells the following story. We have drawn in a number of folks with different disabilities who enjoy the combination of more intimate worship with the fellowship of a regular meal. One Sunday, a woman with serious disability took the bread and dipped it in the cup. A sudden jerk of her hand sent droplets of juice flying in every direction. But with obvious delight, she responded, "This is so good." She then said with a sigh and a smile, "I like being next to Jesus." It was a beautiful and a holy moment as she sprinkled those around her with grace. This is a story about a Eucharist in a non-Anglican communion. But its power is that it reminds us that the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, is about sharing in God's love. Our Eucharistic tradition teaches us that when it is consecrated, both bread and wine are holy or set apart as they have become the body and blood of Christ. So we take great care not to spill the wine, and if a wafer is dropped on the ground, I, the priest, immediately take it and I consume it. So this is a very, very different tradition we are dealing with. Wine is never thrown away, nor is consecrated bread or wafers. They are to be consumed or to be set apart for later use in our tradition. But the story is not about an irreverent woman at all, but a woman who through her disability is able to see God's love poured out in the sprinkling of grape juice, which has been consecrated. She experiences this love as it is shared in the Jesus meal with others who accept and welcome her as she is. No one rebukes her for spilling. They delight in her joy. So I ask you to take a moment to think of what happens when you receive your Holy Communion. Is it a solemn me and my God moment? Or are you conscious of others receiving God's love? Do we celebrate God's love for our community and the world when we receive communion? I must admit, when I wrote these words, I was challenging myself again. So easy after 30-odd years of ministry to sort of just take for granted this which we are given the privilege of celebrating every single week. I suppose with COVID it's become more intense for me because often we were not present with the community. We were on our own, particularly last year at this time, the lockdown period. But it's also a reminder that it never really was about me and my God. It is about the community and the joy that the Holy Eucharist often brings. You know me, Nick, on Sunday morning I often look out at the sea and faces and I say to people, "Are you awake?" It's because we come to church so solemn, and Eucharist means to give thanks to God, means to celebrate. And what is a meal but a celebration, really?
It's a feast. And Thanksgiving, I think sometimes we miss those opportune times of being present with everybody when we become just so solemn about it. Because for me, specifically, in celebrating the Eucharist, you become so focused that I shouldn't spill, I shouldn't break the bread in the wrong way, and you start focusing on those things, and at that time you just miss the opportunity to have that hospitality and present that community of all is welcome, come unto me, as God says, come unto me all who are weary. But then at that time, I think because we're so focused on getting it right and holding the hands right and doing everything proper, that you just miss that the actual meaning of it's a celebration. It is life. It is saying, wow, come, yay, we together. I think that's the problem, when we miss those small opportunities. And for me, COVID has taught me that those small times when you think things are just overwhelming, that actually those small things are the important things. And I think that's what I'm missing now more, the hugs and the fellowship that we used to have. So there's a difference in it.
See, you've been a priest for a short period of time, so you're still concentrating on getting it all right. I've been there forever.
So it's like, okay.
No, but it's about, for me then, it's about how do we celebrate?
Yes.
So they're getting quite a different script today as we reflect together. But how we celebrate is why I try and always pray the Eucharistic prayer without taking the words for granted, highlighting differences, using different accent of words, etc. Because it's meant to make us be a different kind of a people.
And for me, it also humbles me to say, wow,
Yes,
look at this in God's presence, and I marvel at it and I'm in awe. So I think sometimes people look at me and say, I got this serious face, but it's just me being at awe and saying, oh wow, God, I have the privilege to celebrate this Eucharist. Sorry, it's just me, Doug.
It's nothing to be sorry about. We all have our different personalities, and it is just an incredible privilege to be with God's people. So now we move into more of the how of the welcome. If you remember last week, we were beginning to explore something of that. Christine Poole reminds us of the following. She says, hospitality is an invitation from God to grow deeper in love. It is also an opportunity to reflect on and to participate in the mutual welcoming and love evident in the life of the Trinity. Miroslav Volf notes, inscribed on the very heart of God's grace is the rule that we can be its recipients only if we do not resist being made into its agents. What happens to us must be done by us. Having been embraced by God, we must make space for others and invite them in, even our enemies. In her very practical writings on hospitality, she suggests that if we are to be hospitable, we must be the following. We must give those we host our full attention, listening to them and talking to them. We must not be grudging in our welcome. We must remember their names and ensure they understand what the group is doing, why it does it, and how it does it. We must include them in our celebrations and enable them to participate fully in our community life. And we must value their insights, contributions, and gifts. She quotes Henri Nouwen, who says, "We will never believe that we have anything to give unless there is someone who is able to receive. Indeed, we discover our gifts in the eyes of the receiver." Can you think of any other qualities needed in a host? You can write these down or share them.
Are we going to say anything about that? What qualities?
Well, I can't think of anything more than that's because I've written the course, so my mind is now
loving.
blank.
Let's be more loving. And also welcoming our enemies here.
That's quite a thought.
So then we'll read Matthew, according to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, reading from verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand, and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. Then he will say to those at his left, You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.
So what do you think this text means? And if you are able, please share these thoughts with others, or else jot them down and think about and reflect on this text during the week. A very practical text, actually. It doesn't say anything in particular about believing in the right way. It speaks about acting in the right way. Very strong text in the life of the early church. And one of the texts they used, in fact, for hospitality, and the early church was known for doing exactly all of these things in a society which had no social welfare, no network, no respect for people, in a world of slavery and patriarchy.
So may it move us to action and being practical, rather than just saying, I'll pray for you, and leaving it there. So read also the Luke chapter 14, verses 12 to 14. He said also to the one who had invited him, When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous.
This text also is central to the idea the early church had on hospitality. The idea that although hospitality was then, as it is today, still for friends and family, that hospitality in that culture was also for influential acquaintances, and it was the common practice both in the Greek and the Roman and the Semitic cultures. Hospitality had to be more than this. Paul writes, Christian fellowship ought to focus on welcoming the vulnerable and the poor into one's home and community of faith. I really am struck by this throughout this Lenten course, and I really wonder, do we truly welcome the vulnerable and the poor into our houses as they did in the early church? Or is it just about our families and maybe somebody who's just going through a bad patch? Do we even do the bad patches anymore? I'm not quite sure. Such hospitality as this would bring no advantage, no social advancement, and would not improve their networking connections, to use our modern terminology, or even lead to their actions being praised. This is because such hospitality, she writes, would reflect God's greater hospitality that welcomes the undeserving, provides the lonely with a home, and sets a banqueting table for the hungry. And this truth is best illustrated in stories. Do you have a story to share?
Well, I would have to say, there was a person that used to pass our gate when I was living with Mum and them, and he used to collect all the rubble, and one day he came and he said, "Can I have a cup of coffee?" And Mum said, "Okay, next, go make the cup of coffee." So I made the coffee and I gave it to him. He drank the coffee. The next day he came again and he said, "Can I have a cup of coffee?" And every day it went on for about a year or so. And then we stopped seeing him. And that to me was the hospitality of just a cup of coffee and presenting some form of love and affection. And even though we gave him the 2-liter bottles and all those things, but it was the coffee that he found of ever warmth in it. And for me, that was being hospitable, and not looking at his raggy clothes and saying we don't know him or he's a stranger. But that doesn't say that we always welcoming a stranger, because sometimes you do become skeptical given our society, and you start thinking, could this be a criminal or something? So, yeah, so my story would be that of showing just a cup of coffee of love. I don't know, Doug, if you
Some
would
people
have.
offer coffee and a rusk. You give coffee and love, which I think is actually far more acceptable. Very often people just need to feel appreciated, particularly when society pushes them to the margins. I'm not going to share a story today. I think I shared one last week. Paul, in speaking of the qualities of a good host, says this: good hosts sort out their priorities regarding time and resources and work through attitudes towards property and possessions. It is hard to open our lives to others if we are not willing to risk loss and damage to the things we value. Sustained hospitality requires a commitment to a simplified lifestyle and a light hold on our possessions. This is very challenging. It's not saying we may not enjoy beautiful things, but it's a reminder that people, rather than possessions, need to be our priority. And you must remember that people like Paul are writing for communities of welcome, which is how they see the gospel as enacted, not gathered communities on a Sunday, although they think that's very important as well, but communities where people live together, or just families or singles, and create community like that.
So a reading from Acts chapter 2, verse 44 to 47. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved.
She further writes that good hosts share the sufferings of others even when they cannot solve the problems, or he or she cannot solve the problems. This is what it means to give life to the Pauline scripture that tells us to bear one another's burdens. She says they do not insist on quick evidence of success, but rather understand the value of small acts of grace. It's a two-way street, hospitality. It also means being willing to be open and receive gifts from others who apparently have little to offer, It means, she says, allowing themselves to be accepted and enjoy their expressions of hospitality. Good hosts, she reminds us, resist the temptation to use hospitality as a means to another end. When we use hospitality as a tool, we distort it. Using words filled with wisdom that does not sit easily on ears accustomed to capitalist ideas of measuring success. Paul writes, we ask sometimes as an expression of good stewardship, what will it accomplish? How is it useful? Hospitality is rich with blessings, but such benefits come as gifts, and even churches must be wary of efforts to turn hospitality into some form of commercial exchange. I had to laugh when I remembered that, but that for me also got caught up in COVID as we were doing the recordings. It was just a gift that we were able to offer to our communities of faith, the services that we were doing in that time. And I'd been going at it for quite a while before somebody said, by the way, we think you should put your banking details at the end of the service. Because I wasn't thinking so much in terms of the commercial gain of it, but I was thinking very much in terms of how are we able to be the Christ, even if I wasn't cognizant of this. This is the Holy Spirit at working, and I'm afraid and that after so many years of ministry, I do find that I often think in terms of these words. What will it accomplish, and how will it be useful? And it's actually a good refresher to be told it may accomplish absolutely nothing in terms of a measurable goal. But who are you to measure anyway? And I've often seen that the blessings of God come in strange and wonderful ways to us, from people we least expect it from, may I add.
Which is amazing.
Now we come to the idea of the Eucharist. We start off with the idea of sharing a meal. The most common form of hospitality, Nikki, you've already mentioned it, I mean, in terms of a cup of coffee, but if you're not having a cup of coffee or tea with somebody else, it is usually that you will share a meal with someone, food of some form or another. And this is a form of hospitality that stretches right across our time and religious and ethnic boundaries, found in all cultures, this practice of hospitality. And the Old and the New Testament are filled with stories of sharing of meals. The sharing of the Passover meal particularly was important to the Jewish community. It commemorates God's deliverance of the people of slavery in Egypt. It's an important part of the Jewish liturgical calendar, and our brothers and sisters will be celebrating Passover before we celebrate Easter. And equally important to Jewish families are the family Shabbat meals. These two meals, which are central to community and the ideas of identity, form the basis of the stories that we have on the Lord's Supper. There's a great deal of argument in scholarly communities on, was the Passover supper a Passover supper, or was it a Seder? Not so important. Even in the Old Testament, there is a linking between God's generosity and deliverance and being generous by sharing hospitality.
So we take a moment and we read Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-matured wines, a rich food filled with marrow, of well-matured wines strained clear. And then we also find in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 1 to 2. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you that have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for what which is not bread, and your labor for what which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good, and delight yourselves in rich food.
The amazing idea of the banquet without any money involved. One author has noted that there are at least 28 instances of meals recorded in the Gospels alone. That's without taking the New Testament into account. Feeding of the 5,000, the story of God's provision and the importance of sharing is found in all 4 Gospels, which really is a testimony to its power. It is therefore correct for Andrew Francis to say, food and its sharing seem central to Jesus' own ways and his revealing of the kingdom of God in word, deed, and prayer. If being a disciple of Jesus is to follow the way of Jesus, there is a significant Jesus pattern of sharing food across the boundaries of society. This countercultural practice of Jesus shown in the Gospels means that it has much to say to the Christian church today. So now, I really had a serious think about this, because most of our coming together is very ritualized, and we're going to come to that later in terms of the Eucharist. But I do wonder, as I see in the past, as I saw a sea of 300, and now I see excitedly 64 people, how many of us actually offer a meal to others of us? Do we really take seriously the idea that if you're going to be a fellowship, you can't just be a fellowship as individuals, you have to really do some sharing of your life. Can't just come to church and disappear on a Sunday and come and disappear again without real interaction. And part of that real interaction is meant to be sharing. I wonder, after all its 30 years of existence, why this church only has 2 Bible study groups. And of course, then there was this tradition of the Tuesday tea, which is unfortunately not present because of COVID at the moment. And then there was the Friday social. But I experienced that when we did have the Tuesday fellowship tea afterwards, not a meal, but again, tea, cake, cookies, wonderful stuff, that people really did share with each other and knew what was going on in each other's lives. And it's really, really very important.
And we also could celebrate people's birthdays, their anniversaries, and you could learn about people that you actually never had the opportunity to engage with from being just in the pew next to each other. But with the tea, you could have more interaction, and you could hear stories and share stories, and even get to know people's like siblings, as to how many siblings they have. And it was so intimate. I actually miss those tea sessions on a Tuesday, because I would sit there and be like, who's this? And every week change chairs.
We know you like the Tanyas anyway, but I mean, the point is that there was this loving engagement. And for some people, who are very lonely or alone, it was an opportunity to really gather. Jean Vanier writes this of the importance of meals in creating community. During the course of the meal, each person has to have a chance to meet all the others. Even the simple gesture of passing the potatoes is a natural moment of communication which can bring people out of their isolation. They cannot remain behind the barriers of their depression when they have to ask for the salt. The need for food encourages communication. As a church that places a great deal of importance on the celebration of the Eucharist or the Holy Communion, we are challenged in terms of what this meal means for us, and how, as an act of hospitality, it becomes an agent of justice and transformation. Claudio Avalas writes, the connection between worship and the world happens in a double movement of the altar or table to the world, and from the world to the table. Unless these worlds start to consciously see their intrinsic relationship, how they belong to each other, and keep interacting and changing each other, our offer of hospitality will be lacking. His book, which concentrates on how in our very act of worship, in the act of celebrating the Eucharist, we can see ecclesiastical, theological, liturgical, socio-economic, and political borders present, is a challenge to see how we can overcome these borders through our Christian hospitality. How do we recognize both the conditions we place on hospitality and the call of God, which is Jesus' call to be good news people who break down the walls of division? How do we make the Christ present, even if only for a minute? He calls this the condition of living with borderless borders. Nice terminology.
Makes one think even more. And now we read from Galatians chapter 3, verse 23 to 29. Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. For in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Jesus Christ. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise.
We Christians who believe and hope to believe have to try to figure out the complexity of life, of all these woven possibilities and impossibilities. So he writes, which we experience as calls to worship, prayer, songs, liturgical action, knowing that our response to God and to the world will always be limited and impermanent. In a beautiful passage which I invite you to read meditatively, he writes the following, and I'm going to deliberately read this a little bit more slowly. By exposing ourselves to one another around Eucharistic tables, we find ways to negotiate and cope with ourselves, with the other, and the world at large. My hope, then, is that Christian communities, if they want to live a radical hospitality, will dare to move away from their rigidity of place, sacrament, understanding, and liturgical practices, and venture into a world that is yet to be created. We must remember that we are on a journey together, a journey towards the New Jerusalem, and on this road we pass by Emmaus and break bread together as we invite Christ to stay with us, because it is dark and we are afraid. By eating together, we see each other's hands and engage with each other's stories. By creating a variety of Eucharistic liturgies, they might help us to expand the borders of our own comprehension of the sacrament, and perhaps, only perhaps, foster a radical theology of hope, of hospitality, that might take the stranger and the poor into greater consideration, even at the risk of losing one's own place at the table.
And that is according to the Gospel, according to Luke chapter 14, verse 7 to 11. When Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
Throughout this Lenten course, we have been working with the theme of hospitality, both as small groups, individuals, and as a parish. As this ends our 5-week Lenten session, write down and commit to one action of hospitality for yourself. Then if you are a group, together write down one act of hospitality, and please not an act of charity, there's a difference, that you commit your group or parish to. And then send your suggestions, if it is a parish act, to the rector or the leadership, and be prepared to be involved in helping that act to become reality. I'm not letting anybody off the hook here. If you make a suggestion, you have to be involved with the implementation of the suggestion. And I'm looking forward to those many suggestions that are going to come in. That will let me know that you've all been listening to Nikki and I, and we will be delighted if we are overwhelmed by suggestions for hospitality. I'm now going to end this course with a meditation, and Nikki and I are going to take alternate paragraphs as we lead you through this meditation. And it's a meditation on how to make the Eucharist meaningful in our lives. And it's taken from a small book. Actually, Andre Noen didn't write it. He wrote the foreword to it, and it's anonymous. It's called Rule for a Brother. It was written for a male monastic community, but it applies to a Christian community at large, and we've changed the language. Wherever it says brothers, we have added sister as well. It's called The Breaking of Bread. By the grace of God, you have been called to a life in which everything is inspired by the sacrament of the Eucharist. You must grow in daily knowledge of this mystery and in a greater love for the Lord who gives himself in it.
The celebration of the Eucharist is the center of your life. It is the highest expression and the strongest support of your life in community. It is the beginning and the end of your actions, the source and consummation of your service to God.
When you celebrate the memorial of Christ, give thanks to God for God's countless benefits. Never tire of praising God, one in heart and voice with your brothers and sisters, and united with Christ, the sacrifice of praise. Renew yourself in the spirit of love and unity, because you are sharing with your brothers and sisters the same bread, the same cup.
The celebration of the Eucharist would be nothing but a romantic or ecstatic sensation. So you forget that the heart of it is the self-giving of Jesus. The sacrifice of yourself for the sake of the others is the single foundation of every community. Unite yourself with the Lord, then in a fruitful and acceptable offering for the life of the world.
You are nourished at the Lord's table and filled with his riches. So be ready to break the bread of your life for the poor and hungry everywhere in the world. Keep nothing for yourself, but share with others all that you have received from God's tenderness.
You are called especially to give the sacrament its full effect in unity and service. The unity of all Christians and all people must be closest to your heart. Always and everywhere, you are called to rise above oppositions and divisions in the universal love of Christ. Always look for what unites and fight everything that estranges and separates people from each other.
And with that meditation, we end our Lenten course and pray that you may have a blessed Holy Week and a glorious and holy Easter resurrection celebration. We thank you for bearing with us, watching with us, sharing with us.
Thank you.